Every tomato on every burger served at every McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's in the United States right now came from the same 30-mile stretch of Florida flatland. And the family that controls that land has never once appeared on a list of America's most powerful people, even though they may hold more leverage over the American food supply than almost anyone alive. That is not an approximation. That is not a generalization about regional agriculture. That is the documented, verifiable, quietly extraordinary reality of the Immokalee tomato growing region in southwest Florida, a place most Americans have never heard of, cannot locate on a map, and will never visit. A place where the soil is sandy and the summers are brutal and the labor conditions have triggered federal investigations and international human rights campaigns. And a place where, for reasons that have everything to do with climate, logistics, and the brutal economics of industrial food supply, approximately 90% of all fresh tomatoes consumed in the United States during winter months are grown, packed, and shipped from one county, in one state, to every burger, every sandwich, every fast food value meal in the nation. The American burger industry runs on Immokalee tomatoes. And what that dependence has created, the power it has concentrated, the vulnerabilities it has hidden, and the human cost it has generated and then buried, is one of the most important stories in American food that the industry has spent decades hoping you would never connect end to end. To understand how this happened, you have to understand something fundamental about the tomato. Specifically, about why growing tomatoes at industrial scale for a national fast food market is one of the most logistically brutal agricultural challenges in the American food system. A fresh tomato is, by the standards of industrial food supply, almost impossible to work with. It is perishable. It is fragile. It bruises under its own weight at volume. It does not ripen uniformly. And the tomato that a fast food consumer wants, sliced thin, perfectly round, with enough structural integrity to survive the assembly line of a commercial kitchen and the handling of a delivery driver and still look presentable on a burger at the point of consumption, is not the tomato that nature produces when left to its own timeline. It is a tomato that has been bred, harvested at a precise moment of pre-ripeness, shipped at a precisely controlled temperature, and gassed with ethylene upon arrival to trigger a cosmetically acceptable ripening process that has nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with shelf life and appearance. The tomato on your burger was never allowed to fully ripen on the vine. It was engineered to survive the supply chain. And Immokalee is the place where that engineering happens at the scale the American burger industry requires. But that's not the craziest part. Here is the number that makes the agricultural economists go quiet when they say it out loud. The Immokalee growing region, a collection of farms concentrated in Collier County, Florida, produces an estimated 800 million pounds of fresh tomatoes in a peak season. 800 million pounds. From a geographic area smaller than the city of Los Angeles. The concentration of production in this single region is so extreme that it has no real parallel in any other fresh vegetable supply chain in the American food system. And that concentration did not happen by accident. It happened because of a convergence of factors, a specific combination of soil chemistry, frost-free growing windows, proximity to interstate highway infrastructure, and decades of agricultural investment, that no other region in the continental United States has been able to fully replicate at competitive cost. Immokalee is not just where the tomatoes come from. It is where the tomatoes can only come from, at the scale and price point the fast food industry demands. And that geographic lock-in is the foundation of something that functions, in practical terms, as a monopoly, without ever being called one. Picture this. It is January. Every other major fresh tomato growing region in the United States, California, North Carolina, Ohio, is frozen, fallow, or operating at a fraction of peak capacity. The fast food chains need to spec their tomatoes. Need to confirm their supply. Need to write the contracts that will guarantee the volume, the consistency, the price per pound that their profit margins require. They have one realistic option. They call Florida. They call Immokalee. They call the same dozen or so large grower-packer operations that have controlled the majority of the region's output for the better part of 3 decades. And the negotiation that follows is not between equals. It is between the only buyers and the only sellers of a product that 350 million American consumers will encounter every time they order a burger from November through May. The leverage is extraordinary. And it flows in a direction that most people, looking at the power differential between a multinational fast food corporation and a Florida vegetable farmer, would never expect. What happened next, when the fast food industry finally understood the depth of its dependence, produced one of the most quietly aggressive supply chain intervention campaigns in the history of American food. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, the major fast food chains began a systematic effort to reduce their Immokalee dependency through 3 parallel strategies. First, aggressive development of offshore supply alternatives, investments in tomato growing operations in Mexico, specifically in the Sonoran state of Sinaloa, designed to compete with Florida volume on price and shipping time. Second, direct funding of agricultural research programs aimed at developing tomato varieties capable of meeting fast food spec tolerances in growing regions with shorter seasons, effectively trying to break the Florida frost-free monopoly through genetic engineering. And third, the introduction of hydroponic and controlled environment agriculture partnerships, greenhouse tomato operations in northern states that could theoretically produce year-round supply without Florida's climate advantages. All 3 strategies produced partial results. None of them broke the Immokalee monopoly. Because the economics of industrial fresh tomato supply at national scale kept converging on the same answer. Florida is cheaper. Florida is closer to the eastern seaboard population centers where the majority of American fast food consumption occurs. And Florida, with all its complications, with all its labor controversies, with all its climate vulnerability, remains the only place in the continental United States where a buyer can source 800 million pounds of fresh tomatoes in a single season at a price point that keeps the dollar menu viable. The chains tried to escape. They couldn't. And the attempt to escape, the billions of dollars of supply chain diversification investment that went into it, is itself a measure of how much power one Florida county had accumulated over the American burger. But here is where the story takes a turn that the fast food industry's public relations teams have never wanted to discuss with the same clarity that they discuss supply chain efficiency and food safety protocols. The labor system that makes Immokalee tomatoes commercially viable is one of the most documented sources of agricultural labor abuse in the United States. For decades, the Immokalee tomato fields were ground zero for some of the worst labor conditions in American agriculture, conditions that federal prosecutions repeatedly characterized not as labor violations but as slavery. That word, slavery, used in official Department of Justice press releases about active prosecutions, in cases where workers were found held against their will, threatened, transported in locked vehicles, forced to work under armed guard in tomato fields in Florida. In the United States, in the 21st century, at least 12 federal prosecutions for slavery and human trafficking in agricultural labor were brought against Immokalee area operations between 1997 and 2015. 12. In one county. Over 18 years. And during that same period, the fast food chains purchasing those tomatoes were, in most cases, paying prices per pound that agricultural economists and labor rights advocates argued made humane labor compensation mathematically impossible within the existing supply chain economics. The price of the tomato on your burger was set at a level that could only be sustained by paying the people who picked it less than a living wage, in conditions that federal prosecutors repeatedly found crossed the line from exploitation into crime. Now consider what happened when that connection, between the burger price and the field condition, was made publicly and unmistakably by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a farmworker advocacy organization that launched one of the most extraordinary corporate accountability campaigns in modern American labor history. Starting with Taco Bell in 2001 and expanding to McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, Whole Foods, and Walmart over the following decade. The CIW demanded a penny per pound premium, 1 additional cent for every pound of tomatoes purchased, to be passed directly to the farm workers who harvested them. Not a regulation. Not a lawsuit. A penny. The fast food chains resisted. Some of them for years. And the resistance itself, the spectacle of billion-dollar corporations fighting to avoid paying a penny per pound to the workers at the bottom of their supply chain, generated the kind of sustained public attention that eventually made resistance more expensive than compliance. One by one, the chains signed the Fair Food Program agreements.